For each increase in protein by 1 gram per kilogram, there was an increase of 8.2 points in the MDI. So you can buy 8.2 MDI points for just 1 gram of protein per kilogram. I think that's a very good price. I don't know how you value MDI points, but most babies would be very happy to buy MDI points for just 8.2 for 1 gram per kilogram. And for calories, the relationship was not as strong, but you for 10 calories increase in intake during the first week of life, average week intake, you get 4.6 points increase in MDI. Or in other words, if you don't give calories, you don't give protein, you knock off MDI points. And for those of you who are not familiar with MDI, the 18 to 20 month MDI is a strong predictor of later intelligence quotient, IQ. It's not a perfect predictor, because many of these children still improve after 18 months, but it is a strong predictor of IQ. So, next slide. We can say poor growth is due to inadequate nutrition. Inadequate nutrition causes impaired neurocognitive development. And poor growth is therefore a marker of poor neurocognitive development. The babies who show the slowest growth have the worst outcome. And conversely, if we improve their growth, we can help them preserve IQ points. It's as simple as that. If we don't give them nutrition, we knock off knowing them. Okay, now first of all, I need to answer the question requirements for what we usually define the requirements nutrients needed for normal growth and for normal neurocognitive development. But a normal neurocognitive development is difficult to assess, so we calculate our requirements based on normal growth. And normal growth for premature infant is growth similar to that of the fetus. Many of you will immediately say, well, a baby that's growing has a different body composition than a fetus. There is less body water percentage-wise, etc. And that's all true, but we don't have a better model. Unless somebody knows of a better model, I'll be very happy. But I don't think we have a better model than the fetus. So our estimates of nutrient requirements are based on the fetus. Next slide. The nutrient requirements we can calculate by the factorial approach, which is the one I'll show you in a minute, and then there's the empirical approach, where we look at studies that have used varied protein intakes to determine how much is needed to achieve a certain growth. Next slide. How do we know? How do we do the factorial approach? Next slide. Can we do the next? Okay. In the factorial approach, we first look at how much does the fetus add each day. In the case of protein, it happens to be around 2 grams for the very smallest, for the 25, 26 week, is the accretion. Then we calculate how much protein we have to give the baby so the baby can retain that much protein. And so we need to factor in inevitable losses, the efficiency of conversion, and the efficiency of intestinal absorption. Next slide. So, fetal accretion, we know from body composition data available from more than 160 fetuses that have been chemically analyzed. And this started back in 1860 in Germany. There was a publication about the body composition of fetus, babies born, stillborn, or died soon after birth. But then we have more data in the 20th century. Gestational age is not always available, but we have chemical data of various quality and comprehensiveness for a large number of babies. Next slide. And we put together, from the data in the literature, the body composition of what we call the reference fetus. And once you have the body composition, we had to magnify it a little bit, because the babies tended to be small, that were chemically analyzed, suggesting that many of them were mildly or moderately intrauterine growth retarded, so we had to magnify that. Next slide. from the reference fetus, we can then determine the protein accretion in each day. And this is plotted here. This is gestational age. B stands for birth, and this is the term infant, what we know for the term infant. And what you see, and this is accretion in grams per day, that protein accretion peaks around 34 to 36 weeks and then decreases, which is in itself interesting. So our peak absolute accretion, our peak growth is around 34 to 36 weeks. If we, next slide, normalize this accretion to per kilogram body weight, grams per kilogram per day, then we get this smooth curve. And you're going to see that at birth, this process, this decrease is not completed. That's the reason why the term infant has a higher protein requirement than the infant at 6 months of age. That's why mother's milk has a higher protein content in the first 2 months than later on. But for the fetus, we can take this secretion in grams per kilogram per day, and at next slide, we can then, this table shows it in grams per day again, but we add in dermal losses, urinary losses. All this is from the literature. Dermal losses of nitrogen have been determined by carefully washing premature babies. So this is all based on real data. Required absorbed is the total of 2.967 here, and then we factor in inefficiency of absorption, and we may have gone overboard a little bit here, but this is again based on the literature, and we come up with a protein requirement for 4 grams per kilogram per day, and that's the number I would like you to keep in mind. 4 grams per kilogram per day is the protein requirement of the small premature infants. It's as simple as that. 4 grams per kilogram. If we relate it to caloric requirement, then it becomes 3.7 or 3.8, depending on how much calories we assume. So that's 3.7. It's as simple as that. Next slide. Now I show you, with the factorial approach, we can calculate the requirements for parenteral nutrition and for enteral nutrition. This is for parenteral, and the next slide shows it to you, and I'll talk more about it. Next slide. For enteral feeding. Here is now this number 4 again, and you see all the way up to 1200 grams, the protein requirement remains 4 grams per kilogram. But as the baby then gets bigger, the protein requirement decreases. That's an important thing to remember. The smallest babies have the highest requirements. With calories, it's different. With calories, the bigger babies have higher requirements. But it's difficult to speak of requirements here because the reason we calculate higher energy intakes is for the bigger babies is that they begin to put down more fat in adipose tissue. And that fat in adipose tissue can be variable. So we can't call it a requirement. If a baby gets not 131 calories here, but 110 or 100, the baby simply puts down less fat in adipose tissue. To make a long story short, there's good evidence that 90 to 100 calories per kilogram per day meets the energy needs of the baby for maintenance, that is for resting, for movement, for everything, plus growth of lean body mass. Everything above that is fat, deposited as fat. Okay, so that's what you need to keep in mind when you look at these numbers. Now, when we relate protein to energy and express it as grams per 100 calories, which is the only way we can compare these numbers, these requirements, with the composition of feedings such as mother's milk or formulas, then we get these numbers. And because the calories go in opposite directions as the protein, you see there's a rather dramatic drop. It goes from 3.8, 3.7 in the smallest babies to 2.6 grams per 100 calories in the babies, the bigger babies, a size at which they begin to leave the nursery. So a rather dramatic drop from 3.8 to 2.6. These are the only things I think you ought to know. You ought to know 4 grams per kilogram for the smallest babies, somewhat less for the bigger ones. 105 calories. 100, if you remember 100, that's fine. 100 is what the babies need. Everything in addition, on top of 100 is just fat, and maybe fat is good. or maybe it provides insulation, but it is not essential. And the protein energy ratio goes from 3.8 to 2.6 while the baby's in nursery. And just, I might as well mention that here already. To think that we can, with one feeding, provide the right amount of protein and the right amount of energy for a 500-gram baby and to an 1,800-gram baby is just not correct. One formula for all these babies is not correct. Our formulas that we have, the premium formulas, have a protein energy ratio of 3. So it's too low for all babies less than 1,500 grams. The fortified mother's milk, and I will talk more about that tomorrow, and if time permits I will talk a little bit this morning. Fortified mother's milk has at 2 weeks of lactation, that is 2 weeks milk that the mother pumps 2 weeks after birth, has a protein energy ratio about 3.2, which is too low. It does not meet the protein energy needs of the smallest babies. Now, mother's milk itself, mature mother's milk, has a protein energy ratio of 2.2, and that is way down here. It's not possible to meet the protein needs of the baby with mature mother's milk or with premature mother's milk without fortification. As Dr. Anu pointed out, it would require the baby to be fed a huge volume, like more than 330 milliliters, which a baby cannot tolerate, plus the baby would get an excess of calories. For all these reasons, we must fortify mother's milk, so we meet the baby's needs for protein and for other nutrients. Next slide. The factorial approach also allows us to calculate the requirements for all the other nutrients for which we have chemical analysis: calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, sodium, potassium, chloride. Among the trace minerals, I didn't put them on the slide, we have data for iron, for zinc, copper. Next slide. So the other approach, this was the factorial approach. The other approach to estimating nutrient requirements is the empirical approach, where the protein intake is varied and we observe the weight gain. The intended variable is weight gain, but in some studies also nitrogen balance has been used. And so we can, by this approach, determine the protein intake that gives us specified weight gain, either fetal weight gain or catch-up weight gain. So that's the advantage of this. As it turns out, we have no empirical data for babies less than 1,200 grams. So empirical data we have for bigger babies, not for small babies. Next slide. This is how it looks. I've made a graph like this many years ago from published data. Each symbol is the mean value from one study for a group of babies. And you see, as the protein intake increases, so does the weight gain. And again, this is grams per day. A fetal weight gain is around 30 grams per day. With high protein intakes, this graph suggests you can achieve weight gain that's greater than a fetal weight gain, i.e. catch-up growth. The next slide. Next one. Thank you. This is from the famous series of studies by Hurd and Kashyap. Again, each symbol is the mean value. Delta weight stands for weight gain per kilogram per day. This is not per kilogram per day, where the fetus has about 18. With higher protein intakes, and each of these were all babies fed formula, the mean birth weights were around 1,400 grams. None were less than 1,200 grams. You see that with increasing protein intake, there is increasing weight gain. And again, with high protein protein intakes greater than 3.5 grams per kilogram, there is weight gain greater than that of the fetus, that is catch-up growth. And when they tried to make a plot like this for energy, instead of